My name is Frank Salter from the British Australian community, and today I'll be talking about apartheid. This is a history lesson, treated as a history lesson. We have with us today Professor Eric Louw, retired from the University of Queensland, where he was teaching and researching political communications. I've discovered that Eric is a fascinating source of not just political analysis, but amazing anecdotes about South Africa. He has a history of a long association with the ANC, and therefore can give us an inside view of South Africa's transition from apartheid to one nation democratic rule. So with no further ado, welcome, Eric. Good to have you with us.
Yep.
Would you please introduce yourself, where you were born, educated, were you taught in South Africa and so on, and then when you came to Australia?
I grew up in Rhodesia. Went to school in Rhodesia. My family were Rhodesian from pioneer stock, so they were there a long time. When I finished school, I then moved to South Africa to go to university. And I was then, when I was finished university, I got called up into the South African Army. Everybody got called up, like Israel. Spent 2 years in the army. At the end of that, became a journalist at the Pretoria News. So the Pretoria News is an English liberal newspaper in Pretoria. While I was working there, I decided to continue my studies. So I would work as a journalist during the day, and then over the weekends and at night, I would write a thesis. When I finished my thesis, I was offered a job as an academic, and ultimately I spent I worked at a number of universities in South Africa, but the one where I was the longest was at the University of Natal in Durban. At the time when I worked in Durban as an academic, I was also, at that stage of my life, very involved in, I got involved in politics. So that's when I got involved with, the ANC was banned, but the internal wing of the ANC was the UDF, and I was involved with them, plus a number of NGOs, which I set up and worked with, which also did political work, in fact.
When was that? When?
That was the 1980s. So the 1980s was my period in Durban. The 1980s was, of course, the period which people outside South Africa would remember the images of warfare, of civil war, when everybody was killing everybody else. So it was a very intense period. So during the 80s, I lived in Durban, and as I say, I worked at the University of Natal, but I also did all this political work. The universities provided cover. I mean, there were organizations that literally provided cover for political activity, and one of them was universities. Another were the churches. So there were certain organizations which you got involved with them, and then the state didn't touch you, basically. Okay, worked at universities in South Africa. Then in 1994, there was the transition. The negotiations to change South Africa happened in the early 90s. So from 1990 to 1994 was the period of negotiations. It was a period of intense change in South Africa. And it was also when the ANC got unbanned, all these exiles came back into the country. The ANC didn't exist inside the country. It had been, it was obliterated during the apartheid period. And so because it didn't exist, when the ANC was unbanned, all the ANC people were in exile. They were either in Eastern Europe or they were in America. In Africa. They were in America as well. But mostly they were in Eastern Europe and Africa. They all started pouring back into the country. What we had to do was to set up structures for them. So I was one of the people asked to set up the Durban structures. So we set up interim committees to bring these people back and house them politically. And for a year, the interim committee was running before there were elections for positions. So I saw that transition. I saw the transition, if you like, from the UDF to the ANC. I saw these people come back, They brought with them Stalinism, and they brought with them unrepentant Stalinism, the ones from Eastern Europe, and they brought with them also African Uhuru nationalism. That's what the ANC became, was a curious mix of those two. And I, along with many other people who had fought, if you like, during the 1980s for the ANC, became disillusioned and thought, no, this is not for me. I don't feel comfortable with this. And we just stopped going. We just pulled out. So by the time Mandela came to power, I was thoroughly disillusioned because I was hearing one thing projected to the world and another thing internally, which bothered me a lot. And so I left, decided to come to Australia. And of course, then taught at universities in Australia for the longest period at the University of Queensland.
What was the single strongest event that disillusioned you with the ANC?
Okay, it probably wasn't an event as a process. As I saw these people come back, they were filling up. So the ANC, we set up these committees. And when we set up the committees, it was UDF people that set up the committee. So those activists who stayed in the country and had fought apartheid inside the country, we set up these committees. As these ANC exiles came back into the country, they filled up the committee. And we're talking thousands and thousands of people here. And they brought with them this curious politics, as I say. Unrepentant Stalin. I mean, a lot of these people had been in East Germany. East Germany was one of the main funders of the ANC. And they had literally been in East Germany when the Berlin Wall came down. And these were unrepentant Stalinist communists. They were horrified. They could not believe this had happened. So they brought this horror with them. And they weren't going to let that happen again. I mean, they wanted South Africa to be a communist state. That's what they wanted. And then mixed with that was this black nationalist Uhuru thing, which was dated. In fact, they were both living in a dated world. If you think about it, the 1960s Uhuru and 1960s Stalinism is what the ANC was all about. They hadn't moved on, whereas the UDF had moved on. The people inside the country.
Interesting. Now
and so it was just like, no, these people what are these people talking about? And I was hearing this curious mix of communism and black nationalism that horrified me. And of course, but they were projecting to the rest of the world the Mandela image, which was like, I'm a happy liberal grandfather and I'm going to build a liberal democracy. And I'm going, no, you're not. That has nothing to do with what you want to do here. So I'm hearing this disjuncture between the two.
Interesting. I have to confess, I haven't studied South African politics or history very, very closely. So I have largely the popular view, maybe slightly different, popular view of South Africa, which was the apartheid was a system of segregation, of exploitation of the blacks, of denying them the vote, of cruelty, and of insult and loss of dignity. I know we're going to discuss that in some detail. Could you define for me what actually was the original goal? You were telling me, for example, that apartheid was actually conceptualized back in the 1930s.
Yeah.
What was the original goal and how did it fall short?
Okay, well, as I say, the original concept was, in fact, formulated back in the 1930s and then developed slightly further in the 40s. Okay, now what was that? It was a response to the Boer War, which most people don't realize. So it was an internal struggle between Afrikaners and English-speaking South Africans. It wasn't about black people. Okay, black people were not part of the political process in South Africa, and so you didn't have to consider them, and that wasn't the struggle. Okay, so the struggle was the Boer War impoverished many Afrikaners because they were driven off the land. Their farms were burnt, their towns were burnt. They were put in concentration camps. 20% of the population died in concentration camps. It was devastating. I mean, the place was a wreck afterwards. It was like Germany after the Second World War was a wreck. Now these farmers, because they were farmers, it was a farming community, they were driven off the land. Yeah. And the British then come in and they create a new state called the Union of South Africa. South Africa is a British invention. The country, the boundaries are drawn by the British. They create a new country, a new political dispensation, which is the Westminster system. But they also build a new economy, and the new economy is the one based upon gold mining. So it's the one you think of, and it was indeed. There was a lot of exploitation because it was based upon the British model was invented by Cecil Rhodes, the economic model, and the model was to import black tribesmen in huge numbers to the country to work on the mines for very little, doing unskilled labor. So Rhodes worked out a system of how you could take people with no skills but turn them into economic productive units, if you like.
Mm-hmm.
That was brilliant. And it created the economy that South Africa had, which was this deep-level mining industry. Okay, but now these Afrikaners that had been driven off the land were impoverished, and they lived in squatter camps. They lived in the images you see of shacklands in Rio de Janeiro. It was like that. They were living in absolute poverty. And these were mixed-race slums. So Afrikaners were living with black people in mixed-race slums and intermarrying with them, which horrified the Afrikaans middle class, as you can well imagine. The people that invented apartheid were people like Verwoerd, for example, and they were professors of social work. They were working with these people, with these poor people, and they went, this can't carry on. We have to do something to stop this. How do we stop this poverty? And they blamed the British, and they blamed the British system, and they blamed the British economy. And they said, this has to end. So that is the birth of Afrikaner nationalism. Okay. And apartheid was a response to how they thought the country was going to develop in the future. So they looked at the model that the British Empire had put into place, which was this deep-level mining using cheap black labor that you import in mass. Like, it's a little bit like importing labor into Europe now when they say we haven't got enough people to work. So we're just going to import the third world. That's what they were doing. They were importing the third world into South Africa.
And were they socializing with them?
No, because the British the British system is one of segregation. Now, segregation is where you create one economy, where you all work together in the same economy, but you don't live in the same society. So you work together during the day in the same economy, but at night you go back to your separate areas.
So hold on a moment. This is my first surprise moment.
Yeah.
You're telling me that the originators, the people who conceived of apartheid, were opposed to segregation?
Absolutely.
Explain that for me.
Okay, so what these National Party guys do, these Afrikaner nationalists, they're opposed to it for two reasons. One, they say, the segregation model it's the importation of large numbers of blacks and then segregating them. And they call that a kind of caste society, which it was. And they say, this is unsustainable. This is unsustainable because you're using black labor on a mass scale, but you're not giving them any political rights or indeed even any social rights. That's unsustainable because they're going to get damned angry and you're creating a revolution here, particularly if you're bringing large numbers of them in because we're going to get swamped by them. So they were deeply worried that they said the country would be swamped by black people. So you're going to bring lots and lots of black people, millions of black people in. It's the same argument you hear in Europe now when they say, why are we bringing all these migrants in? We will eventually become a minority and be replaced. That's what they were saying.
That was their concern.
So they were saying, we will be replaced. The white society we've built in South Africa will be replaced by a black society. But worse than that, they said what the British were doing was semi-westernizing them. So you weren't even westernizing. You weren't turning them into black Western people. You were turning them into black semi-Western people because they were tribesmen who went back to their original homelands. You kept their wives back there and their children back there. So you were only semi-westernizing them. And they said eventually the country will be filled with millions and millions of semi-westernized black people who will become the demographic majority. And at a certain point, they will say, this is our country. And then what? And of course, what they said because their argument was against British business. What they were called the landlords, these rich guys, okay? Now, the landlords needed two kinds of labor for the mines. One, they needed these cheap black guys that were unskilled, okay, and they just dug holes, basically.
And they wanted them to remain unskilled.
Of course they did. Of course, no, absolutely no. You don't want them to be anything else except that. That's work. The model's working. Why would you? In fact, you couldn't run this. You couldn't run South African gold mining if you had to pay proper wages. It would be unsustainable. So you had to keep them like that indefinitely, which is of course what the national body said. You're not going to get away with this indefinitely. You might think you will, but at some point they're going to get really angry with you. But the other type of labor they needed was the skilled artisans. You did need skilled people as well. And what the miners were doing is they were bringing British migrants in, skilled British artisans. So they were bringing in British artisans and black labor from the tribal areas and flooding the country with these people. And Afrikaners are going, hey, this used to be my country. What are you doing? That was the objection. And they were saying, segregation is not going to work. So what do we have to do? And they said, well, we don't want this British-made state. They said, you have created a state which throws people together who do not belong together. That was the basic argument. You're throwing people together who do not belong together. We don't want the state that you built because you're making us a minority in what was our own country.
Notice that I'm struck by the role of ethnicity versus race in this.
It's not about race.
It's about ethnicity.
Absolutely.
Which overlaps with
Absolutely.
race.
It's about ethnicity.
But they were resentful about the English migrants being brought
Absolutely.
in as well.
They were very concerned about the English migrants.
That was also marginalising them as well.
Well, in fact, the person who built the system was a person called Lord Alfred Milner. He was the Governor General at the time who ran the system. And he had a deliberate policy of anglicizing the white people. So he said, we'll end up with lots of cheap black labor and one white race. Afrikaners were to be anglicized. So, for example, one of the things he did is he forbade the speaking of Afrikaans at the schools. They were forced to speak English and were beaten. So if a brother and a sister were caught speaking Afrikaans to each other at school, they were beaten for doing so. So you can imagine how that generated nationalism immediately.
Exactly.
Now, what then happened is, and this is one of the curious things about apartheid, is that the people that stepped into the breach was the Dutch Reformed Church. Because it was, in fact, the only Afrikaans institution that was not destroyed by the Boer War. So the Dutch Reformed Church is still in place. And the Dutch Reformed Church set up their own schools in Afrikaans. They were illegal. They were illegal schools, but they ran them anyway. And Afrikaans parents would send their kids to these schools. Now, this is interesting because they called them, these church schools were called Christian national schools. And the people who credit apartheid, their own word for apartheid was not apartheid. It was Christian nationalism. They always called themselves Christian nationalists. And they called their education system Christian national education, which came from those schools. So it's all part of the story. And the very first thing they did when they took over the country in 1948 was to create Christian national schools and to forbade Afrikaners from sending their kids to English-speaking schools.
Interesting.
Because they wanted them, it was about English. The initial target
culture again.
It was about culture. It was like, we don't want our children to be English. We don't want to be assimilated into your single Anglo world. We want to be our own people.
Now, there's an element of that critique of those early theoreticians that I just want to clarify.
Yeah.
And you already touched on it, it concerns the development, the economic and cultural development of the black, low income earners. That was built in. That was an integral part of the British capitalist model, was keep them undeveloped.
Yes.
To keep wages
In
down.
fact, that is white supremacy.
And powerless.
That is white supremacy.
That's a form of white supremacy. How actually did the originators of apartheid deal with that? What was their position?
Right, so the original theorists in the 1930s in fact, say this is white supremacy, which is unsustainable. Because they're saying, what you're doing is you want to put all of us whites on top and keep us there forever and keep blacks under us. So they call it horizontal differentiation.
Like a caste system.
Basically. So they're saying,
Vertical caste.
whites here, blacks there, horizontally, they're oppressed forever. They're not going to tolerate that. So they said, what we want to do is to separate people vertically, not horizontally.
By territory.
Exactly. So the model of apartheid was they said, okay, what we're going to do is we do not accept your state. The South African state, we want to break up your state. So we're going to take over the state. Their objective was to take over the state, not to run the entire state, but to break it up. To break up the British-made state.
Into countries.
Into separate ethnic countries.
Yeah.
So they look at this, and they were anthropologists that did this. So their main theoretician was a person called Werner Aeselin, who had grown up on a mission station, spoke multiple black languages, but he became an anthropologist. So he looked at this and he said, in South Africa, I can identify 9 separate, Westerners would call them tribes. The National Party stopped calling them tribes and said, no, they're nations. A Zulu, you have a right to be, you're a Zulu nation, just as much as a Frenchman has got a nation or an Englishman has a nation. Zulu should have their nation too. So their objective was they were going to divide South Africa up into these separate nations. Each black tribe or nation would be given its own national state. And then every black person would become a citizen of one of those states. The idea is you would develop them into proper states. They would eventually become independent. And when they were independent, if black people were citizens of that state, they would cease to be the citizens of South Africa. And eventually there would be no black people left as citizens of South Africa, but all black people would have the vote.
So that was the goal.
That was the model.
The vision.
Yeah.
Vision of it.
Yeah.
And I must comment there, just to take us
Now
back.
that's apartheid, which is full partition, not segregation.
Yeah,
that's the difference.
And
that's the vision.
And it's a vision. So we've got apartheid being very different to segregation. Already that's my first surprise. And the second surprise is apartheid allowed for full development of the potential of all peoples, black homelands, white homelands, British and Dutch.
That's right. So in fact, the theorists actually said what the theorists said was, because they were Christian nationalists, and the one thing you have to understand about Afrikaner nationalists is they are intensely Christian. I mean, it is fundamental to Afrikaner culture that the church is central to your culture. Okay, and because of that, they're Christian. They kind of go, it matters to them. They're going, it's not very nice to suppress black people. And they said that to the British. This is not very nice, you know. I mean, like, why are you doing this? This is awful what you're doing. Because in fact, they said, you're oppressing black people and us as Afrikaners. We understand how they feel because you're doing the same thing to us. And we think this is not terribly crash hot. So in fact, what we want to do is we want to liberate them as we want to liberate ourselves. What we want for ourselves is our own state. And our own ethnicity is preserved in that state.
No.
And we want to give that to Zulus and Xhosa and all these other guys. Well, we want to give to them what we want to give to ourselves.
That's the vision.
That's the vision.
It didn't come to pass.
That's true.
Let's now take a different trajectory.
Yeah.
And I want you to tell us how the demographic situation in South Africa came to be. Right. So it's going to have to be a really roughshod, brief history.
Indeed.
But you had, for example, 400 years ago, the initial Dutch settlers and so on, who was there and so on, and bring us through to a situation, say in 1948, when the Afrikaners took power, and then when they handed over power in the 1990s. Could you quickly give us a thumbnail?
Okay. All right. Right, the first thing to recognize about South Africa is that black people are not the original inhabitants of South Africa, which, in fact, they're realizing that now. When they claimed that they owned all the land, the original inhabitants, of whom there are not many left, said, excuse me, no, we were the original inhabitants, you guys were migrants here as well, which they were. Okay, so, the original inhabitants of Southern Africa are called the Khoisan. In the West, the Bushmen are Khoisan. Hottentots are Khoisan. But you can't use those words anymore. You now have to call them Khoisan. Okay? All right, now, and they were the inhabitants of the whole of southern Africa. So the whole of South Africa at one stage were Khoisan. The black people originated in what is now Cameroon. That's where they...
Hold on, Khoisan aren't black?
No.
What are they?
They're a completely separate ethnicity all on their own. In fact, if you look at them, they're kind of yellowy. They're a light brown yellow color,
Right.
but they look more Asian than African. They do not consider themselves African.
Interesting.
And in fact, they've become the colored people.
Mm.
So, and I find that people outside South Africa become really upset if you use the word colored, because they think you're using it the way Americans use colored, and that's not how South Africans use colored. Colored is an actual ethnic group. They truly have their own culture. They consider themselves an ethnic group on their own, with their own traditions, their own identity, etc. And they are a product of slaves who were brought to South Africa, who mixed with the original Khoisan to create colours. But anyway, we'll go back to...
Black colonisation of the Khoisan.
But we'll start with when white guys arrive in Cape Town.
Right.
When the white guys arrive in Cape Town, so 1652 is when Dutch guys arrived there. At that stage, you could have divided South Africa almost exactly 50-50, what's now South Africa. The western half of the country was entirely Khoisan. There were no black people there. None at all. Only Khoisan. So we're Cape Towners, all that area, Khoisan people. The northern part of the country did have black people. They'd started arriving, and they were still migrating.
How long have they been there in the northern?
Well, it's a moot point, and people have debated it. It would seem that black people had probably started arriving in the northern parts of South Africa, maybe 1,000 years, something like that, about 1,000 years before whites got there, right up in the north, okay? Mm-hmm. And they've been slowly moving south because it's an empty space. I mean, one of the things about Africa is it's very empty. Up until the 1950s, Africa was very empty. It's the population exploded because white colonists, the naughty white colonists, put hospitals there, and there's been this huge population explosion since the 1950s. But Africa was really very empty up until then. And so tribes moved around and just occupied new empty territory. So the guys coming down from the north, who are called the Bantus, it's called the Bantu expansions when black people came out of the Cameroons, they'd been occupying South Africa and moving systematically south, down the east coast of South Africa.
They were pastoralists, am I right?
Yeah, they were pastoralists, yeah. Whereas the Khoisan were hunter-gatherers. They were like aboriginals, okay? So they hadn't become pastoralists yet.
Right.
Now, the black guys are migrating down from the north and settling, doing exactly what white guys are doing. So white guys, the Dutch guys from Cape Town, were settling by moving eastwards. So the white guys are moving from Cape Town eastwards, and the black guys are moving down from the north. And they met at a place called the Fish River, which is now in the middle of South Africa, at a place called, it's still called Border. Everybody in South Africa calls that part of the country the border. Even though there's no border there at all anymore. But there was a river called the Fish River, which is where blacks and whites first encountered each other. And then it started 100 years of warfare between whites and the Xhosa, who were the tribe that they met there. So, okay, so now at that point, that would have been in about 1700. So whites and blacks first encountered each other in 1700. Okay? So whites had already been there for 100 years at that point. But they'd been colonizing the western part of the country. And in fact, white guys brought slaves. People don't know that slaves were brought to Africa. Now, the Dutch brought slaves to Africa, to Cape Town, because there were no black people, and they considered the Khoisan too primitive. They kind of went, we can't even train these guys. They're hunter-gatherers, and it's just too hard. So we're going to have to get labor from somewhere. And interestingly enough, there was a debate within the Dutch East India Company as to what do we do. One of the options was, at that stage, apparently there was an economic collapse in the Holy Roman Empire, what's now Germany. And so there were lots of unemployed Germans. And there was discussion to bring German peasants to South Africa in huge numbers as your labor force. That would have changed everything.
Yeah.
We would have been like America, basically.
Yeah.
And in fact, the Dutch East India Company was hostile to the idea of colonization. They never wanted to colonize South Africa. So in fact, Cape Town was never a settlement. It was company employees setting up a halfway station to supply the ships going to Indonesia. That's all it ever was.
Mm-hmm.
They never in fact, there were constant restrictions trying to stop the white guys from becoming settlers. They were company employees who would be rotated through the place. Okay, but now they look at this, they go, okay, we're not going to bring settlers because it's too troublesome. They want democracy and rights, and no, it's easier just to have slaves. And so the Dutch East India Company decided to bring slaves to Cape Town. But the slaves they brought to Cape Town were not black slaves. Because at that stage, the Portuguese controlled the slave trading network in the Indian Ocean. They'd taken it over from Zanzibar. And the Dutch bought slaves from the Portuguese. And they brought Asian slaves. So the slaves brought to Cape Town were Indonesians and Indians.
Mm-hmm.
There was one shipload of Madagascans and another shipload of East Africans. So there were 2 shiploads of black guys. But all the rest were actually Asians. And if you go to Cape Town today, it's an Asian city. Cape Town was always an extension of Java, not Europe. Mm-hmm. And it was all the officials and all the people running the Cape were based in Java. Because we were a branch. Connection. South Africa was a branch office of Indonesia, basically, not Holland. Yeah. And so the slaves were brought from there. So in fact, in Cape Town today, there's a whole community called Cape Malays. So if you go there, they're like Indonesians. And South African food is Indonesian. White South African food is Indonesian because the slaves were Indonesian mostly. And these Indonesian slaves intermarried with the Indian slaves. That was the first initial thing. And then later on, when smallpox knocked out the Khoisan, the Khoisan had never been allowed into the settlement. They were kept out there, okay? And then smallpox comes along and wipes out the Khoisan tribal structures, clan structures. And at that point, they pour into the colony as refugees, the remnants. And they then intermarry with the slaves. But the interesting thing is, the Khoisan were never enslaved. They were always free men because they were never brought there slaves. So there was this curious thing that as the Khoisan intermarried with slaves, it was a question of do they stay slaves or do they become free men, etc. And so that produced the colored population. So the Cape population, okay, the Cape Colony, as we like to call it, and it's now the Western Cape Province and the Eastern Cape Province, that part of South Africa, was always occupied by white Dutch settlers and coloreds, not black people. So there's always been this division in South Africa demographically between the Cape and the rest of the country, which comes from that original boundary between where black people lived and where Khoisan lived. And it's still there. You can still see the marker running right through the country. Okay. Now, the Khoisan are Dutchized. They turn into brown. They call themselves brown Afrikaners today. They're brown Dutchmen. They became Christian. The Malays, the Javanese stayed Muslim. So there's a large Muslim population in the Cape. But all the others became Christian and were more or less indistinguishable in many ways from the Dutch, except they were brown. Okay. Okay. So that part of the country has never been African, black African. And they still don't see themselves as Africans, and black Africans do not see them as Africans either. They see them as kind of semi-white guys. Like, who are these people? Okay. Because the culture is Western. Now, the next demographic shift happens, and this is a massive demographic shift that happens in South Africa. In the 1820s is when everything changes. And two things happen. One, the Zulu nation comes on the scene. Shaka Zulu comes along. And he starts what for Southern Africa is like their Second World War. It's devastating. The war rages over the whole of Southern and East Africa. I mean, literally the war goes up to what is now Tanzania. It involves huge swathes of Africa. Because Shaka unleashes what's called the Difakani, which means the great upheaval. And there were these guys just killing each other on a massive scale. Okay? huge depopulations, tribes literally obliterated, wiped out, mass migration. So people migrated from where they had lived to move thousands of kilometers elsewhere. So there was just huge migrations, people moving around all over Southern Africa. And amongst the areas depopulated is the area that would now be called the Free State, where Bloemfontein is. So the people living in that area moved in two directions. One lot moved to what's now Lesotho, up into the mountains because the Zulu couldn't kill them there. And the other guys went all the way to what's now Zambia. And they left the Highveld around what's now Bloemfontein empty, effectively. So these Afrikaner guys, the British had just arrived in South Africa. Afrikaners didn't want to live with them because they were trying to anglicize them then as well. And they go, no, we don't want to live with you guys. We're going to bugger off now. So they send their scouts and discover there's this empty piece of land that they can move to. They go, that's it, we're off, which then creates the Great Trek. That's in the 1830s. So the 1830s, these guys pack up like in their wagons, like with the American West, and they just trek into the interior to what's now the Free State area. But what had happened is one of Shaka's generals had broken away from him, called him Zilikas. He started a whole new tribe called the Matabele. And the Matabele had moved onto the Highveld to somewhere near what's now Pretoria and set up a new kingdom of their own. And they had taken over the whole Highveld area politically. They were in charge of the area. As soon as these Afrikaners moved into the area where they weren't terribly thrilled with this, because although it wasn't on their territory, they kind of went too close. And so they started raiding them and attacking them, which then unleashed a war between the Matabele and these Voortrekkers, these pioneers. And there were basically three very intense battles. The Matabele were beaten in all three battles. And that was unheard of in Southern Africa at the time. Nobody thought you could beat the Zulu or beat the Matabele because they were just amazing military machines. Having been beaten, the Matabele decide, bugger this, these guys, we can't beat them. And they pack up and they leave and they go to what's now Zimbabwe, which is where Matabele land comes from, where Bulawayo is now. Mm-hmm. So they evacuate the Highveld, what's now Pretoria and Johannesburg and the Western Transvaal, and indeed what's now part of Botswana as well. They just evacuate the area and go to Zimbabwe, which leaves the Highveld basically empty. And that's where the Voortrekkers settled. So all these Afrikaners left the Cape and went and settled on this land. And that's why they say, we didn't take anybody's land. It was empty when we got here. And historically it was. Okay, so that's this kind of funny demographic thing that happens, which is like you have the Cape Colony, where the British have now brought their settlers in. So the British bring lots of settlers. So the Cape Colony starts to be a mixture of English settlers, plus the Afrikaners who didn't leave, plus coloureds.
When did the British take over Cape Town?
It's because of the Napoleon.
Roughly Napoleon?
It's
early 19th.
1805, 1806, somewhere around there. And it's because the British, they terrified that Napoleon will take the Cape.
You realise it's contemporaneous with the establishment of Australia, his first British colony.
Yeah. Yes.
So it's 10, 20 years later.
So basically, the British take South Africa to stop it falling into Napoleon's hands, which would mess with the Indian trade route. They were terrified. That's what they wanted it for. They simply wanted Simonstown, actually. Okay, so they seize it, and then when they've got it, they go, oh, oops, we seem to have all of this now. And then they didn't quite know what to do with it. And then they inherited, because as I said to you, black guys had been coming down the East Coast. They'd bashed into each other. In the last years of Dutch rule is when the Dutch met the Xhosa at the Fish River, where whites and blacks met. And it started the war. The British inherit this war. And they can't stop it. The Xhosa, there's just constant warfare in this border area. And the British, they try and fight them, and militarily, because the Xhosa just go into guerrilla warfare and they can't stop it. So the British then decide the only solution is to create a huge block of white settlement in that area on the border. And that's how they bring British settlers. And those are the first British settlers brought to Africa. That was the 1820 settlers. So they bring all these British guys and settle them on the border. And then about 20 years later, they bring another wave of settlers as well, which were they actually called the German Legion, but they were Germans who'd fought for the British in the Crimea War, who were then married off to English girls and brought there as settlers. So the Eastern Cape becomes English.
This, you realise you're describing chaos.
Oh, pretty much, yeah. So, but the Eastern Cape has always been considered English settler country because that's where the British settle, all right? And it does. They say they eventually stabilised the border with the Xhosa, and now you have, so the Cape Colony becomes Western Cape Afrikaans, Eastern Cape English. That's always been like that. Then you have, in the interior, you have these Voortrekker settlers who've moved on to the Highveld. Natal was a slightly different one. What happened in Natal was some of the Voortrekkers went there, set up their own republic there as well, called the Republic of Natal. The British didn't want them to control a port because the British don't like anybody else controlling ports on the Indian Ocean. It was their ocean. And so the British went there, had a little war against Afrikaans and said, bugger off, not yours. And they decided they weren't going to fight the Brits, so they packed up and just went back to the Highveld. And that's how Natal became a British colony. And then the British also brought settlers there. And then Natal is next to the Zulu area.
So we're talking, it's 1840, 1860.
1860s is when they bring the British settlers to Natal.
Can you put numbers to some of these? The major ethnic categories with numbers?
No, but it was never. I mean, even in look, I can't.
They weren't large numbers.
No. I mean, even if you look in at the turn of the 20th century, there was only 1 million people in the whole of South Africa. We're talking small numbers here. We're not talking huge numbers. Okay, it's like it was always it was an empty country. It really was empty. It only took off when you establish mining, and that sets off industry, and then you import all these people, which changes the whole demography of everything.
As you were saying, South Africa began as an agrarian
it's absolutely
society.
Yeah.
And then the British
discovered
gold
and turned it into an industrial society. And they create Johannesburg as this key industrial city. And then Durban becomes the port for the industrial city, and those become the two big cities. And they build an economy around it, which becomes an industrial, urban culture.
And the economic plans then strongly influence the demographic policies.
Absolutely, yeah. So then you're okay. So at the start of the Union of South Africa, it's still a fairly empty country, okay, which has got all these different ethnic groups in it already, but not in large numbers. So, okay, perhaps I should also explain different ways of colonizing. Okay, the way the British colonize is they will look at a piece of territory which they want the resources in, okay, and it happens to be inhabited by the Xhosa, shall we say. So they'll go to the Xhosa and say, we're annexing you. And the Xhosa will say, no, you're not. And then they'll have a war. And then they'll fight it out, and eventually what happens is the British clearly militarily can always beat these guys. So they eventually beat that ethnic group and go, had enough? Over now? You want to have peace now? And when you've had enough, tell us you've had enough and we'll sign a peace treaty. And then your country just becomes ours. We've just taken it over. So the British incorporate the black tribes into their colonies. That was the difference. So the Cape Colony, when the British arrive, has no black people in it. The British incorporate black people because they conquer the Xhosa tribe. And the Xhosa now become part of the Cape Colony. Suddenly you got this huge black population inside the Cape Colony, which changes the demographics completely and the culture completely. They do the same in Natal. When the Voortrekkers, the Dutch guys, colonized, they negotiated a deal with the Zulus saying, that's the river. This side is ours, that side is yours. And we don't mix. We have our space, you have your space. Two separate countries. So they always kept the ethnicities separate. The British come along and go, no, we're just going to annex. So that was the Zulu Wars, which the movie Zulu is about that, where the British just go and they beat the hell out of the Zulu, conquer them, and incorporate Zululand into Natal.
Into the one polity.
Into one polity. So Natal now becomes demographically Zulu, actually.
So what the British are actually doing is establishing a segregation.
Yeah, exactly. In fact, segregation, the first place segregation is ever applied in South Africa is in Natal. first, because the British have brought English settlers to Natal. They then have a war, and they suddenly end up with this huge Zulu nation inside the colony. So, in fact, Zulus are the majority now. But then, in fact, it's slightly more complex because the Zulus never, even though they're beaten in the war, never submit to the British. They just have this pride, like, I'm Zulu. I'm not going to work for you. Bugger off. And they could never get Zulu to work for them. So that's why they brought Indian laborers. So they brought 1 million Indians, like the Fiji thing, to actually work on the land for them. So Natal has always had these 3 different ethnicities in it. But segregation kept them separate.
With those large numbers, shifting demographics, the implication is that if you're going to have segregation, then you need hierarchy. You need a hierarchy.
But that's what it is, precisely. So segregation, per definition, means the British maintain political control, and that, of course, is the white supremacy thing. So white people. So the political system the British set up in 1910. So Australia federates in 1900. South Africa copies the Canadian and Australian model, and they federate in 1910 and create the Union of South Africa. The political system, only white guys have the vote. Well, not quite. Coloureds also had. They gave coloureds the votes too because they westernized. And some black people who were westernized also got the vote. So if you had a certain education or you owned certain property, you also got the vote.
But it was carefully controlled.
Yeah, but basically it was a white polity.
Now notice that the people who originated apartheid came from the Dutch tradition, the Voortrekkers tradition. And what they wanted was countries. What the British wanted was an empire, a working capitalist system.
Well, the British Empire is globalization. It's an empire, and in empires you throw everybody together, per definition.
And if you have to then segregate and stratify them, then you do it.
That's right.
But so we had 2 different imperatives fighting, and the Dutch kept losing until 1948 when they came to power.
They came to power
democratically.
Right. Yeah.
So what did they do then?
Thanks for watching. Professor Louw's fascinating history lesson reminds us of the dangers of complacency. Many white South Africans today are trapped in a terrifying situation which is deteriorating. They have become a hated, marginalised minority discriminated against by the government in their own country. This could have been avoided, but to do so would have required difficult belt-tightening under the leadership of loyal elites. It may be too late to save South Africa. It is not too late to save Australia. The British Australian community is fighting against those who seek to tear down our Western European Christian-based society, which, whilst not perfect, has been the basis of our amazing country. The legitimate interests of white people as a whole are under attack. The right to have our own country, the right to have our children taught pride in that country, and much more. The British Australian community represents and advocates for the collective interests of all European-descended Australians. If we don't defend them, who will? Membership currently works out at rather less than $1 per week. If you want to do more, we would love to hear from you. We'll put the links in the description and look forward to seeing you as a member.
This video has been proudly produced by the British Australian community.